takes on some aspects of a zero-sum game. And most of the things that we talked about with regards to the production of Pareto distributions were measured entities and were trading games as well. So even, because I mentioned to you, for example, that number of basketball hoops successfully managed by NBA players is Pareto distributed, but that's also, those are measurable with money, because of course you get paid to do it, and it is a social game, and so maybe it is an inevitable consequence of trading in a social game that you produce Pareto outcomes. And then I was trying to figure out why, and I've always had this suspicion that what happens to people is that as they move towards zero, positive feedback loops get set up so they're more likely to hit zero. And as they move away from zero, positive feedback loops get set up so that they're increasingly more likely to move away from zero. So here's an example. Let's say you're not doing too bad, so maybe you're in the middle of the normal distribution, then you lose your job. Okay, and let's say you're a conscientious person. And we could say, just for the sake of argument, that you lose your job because of mass layoffs in your company. So it has nothing to do with you. It's fundamentally, it's just like luck of the draw, basically. But then what happens to you? Well, if you're conscientious, you're gonna go after yourself pretty hard. So you're gonna, and especially if you're also high in neuroticism, it's gonna depress you to lose your job. And maybe you're in a situation where you just, for one reason or another, you don't have that many other opportunities. Now, maybe you should have looked for them, but maybe you're in a depressed strata of the economy, or you're geographically located somewhere that makes moving difficult, or so on and so forth, you know. So, but you lose your job, and then you start to get depressed because of that. Well, then as you start to get depressed, you know, it decreases the probability that you're going to look for a job, but it also maybe starts to put stress on your family, and it also starts to decrease the probability that you're going to engage in positive social interaction. So now not only are you unemployed and suffering from economic stress, but your marriage is starting to suffer, and you're starting to isolate yourself from your friends. And then of course, as your marriage suffers and the stress builds up, then that's going to make you more depressed, and that's going to keep you even farther away from your friends, and that's going to decrease the likelihood that you're going to have enough positive emotion and enthusiasm to look for another job. And then, you know, maybe you want to add a bit of a drinking problem to that just for fun, and you can see that you can get a spiral going that's just taking you down, right? And it's all sorts of things, because lots of times people conceptualize, let's say, you know, you're an unemployed guy and you go to counseling and you get a diagnosis of depression. And the thing about a diagnosis of depression, it's sort of like the assumption is there's something gone wrong with your psychological structure. It's like, if you're unemployed and you're depressed, it isn't obvious at all that the problem is in your head. You know what I mean? It isn't even obvious that it's a psychological problem. It's just a problem, and problems can take you out. And so, you know, if you're unemployed and you're under economic stress, and your marriage is starting to shake, and you're isolating yourself from your friends, and you're less likely to be motivated to go look for a job, you can sort of think about that as a depressive spiral, but you can also think of it as a conspiracy, in some sense, of external forces that are auguring you into the ground. And we don't tend to conceptualize psychological disorders that way, but we should, because lots of times when people are suffering from something that you could describe in psychological terminology, and depression is a very good example of that, it isn't obvious that there's something wrong with them psychologically. Often they just are in trouble. And there isn't a category in psychological diagnosis for client in serious trouble. But my experience has been almost without exception that the people that come to see me because something's gone wrong with their life, not because they have a psychological problem. Now you could say, well, their psychological inadequacies, such as they might be, are interfering with their ability to recover, or maybe even served as precursors to, you know, increase the probability of the catastrophe. But it's still not exactly the appropriate way to conceptualize it. And, you know, because there's you inside you, and as a personality psychologist and as a clinical theorist, most of what I've talked to you guys about is your psyche and its structure as if it was like a soul that inhabited you. And there's some real utility in that. You know, you're an individual demarcated from the community. You can be set up in a healthy manner or a non-healthy manner. The problem with that is that you're not just an individual, you're connected to all these external dynamic networks that are really, really important. And it isn't even easy to separate them from you. You know, like you might say, well, this is especially true once you become a parent, is like, is your child more you than your arm? well, you think it's pretty obvious that parts of you that are physically linked are more key to you as an entity, but it's by no means obvious. I think many people would much more happily sacrifice an arm than a child, and so your boundaries are not, where your boundaries are located are not precisely isomorphic with the outline of your body. It's not that simple at all, and so you're embedded in all sorts of networks that can pull you down rapidly or elevate you, because the other thing that happens is that, well, let's say I've never traded with anyone, and I go up to someone and I say, well, do you want to trade? And they say, well, why, how can I trust you? And the answer to that is, well, you have to take my word for it. Well, that's not a very good argument. You might say instead, well, here's what I have to offer and you can evaluate it, but the person's likely to say, well, I don't know how to evaluate it, and so I'm still stuck with taking your word. So that's a bad problem, and you'll see that if you ever try to sell a product in the marketplace, is if the product is new and it's complex, then you're forcing the person that wants to buy it to evaluate it, and then you're forcing them to take the risk of being wrong as well as the time it would take to evaluate it, and they don't like that. What they want is what's often called social proof, which is, okay, well, you want to trade with me, who else have you traded with? And if the answer is 0, then they are going to say, well, you're an interesting person and all that, but I've got these other people over here who've already traded with a bunch of people, and therefore the risk is lower, in part because, let's say, I have a supervisor and I'm going to make a decision, and my primary concern is that my supervisor will not hate me for making the decision. It's not that my primary concern is to make the best decision. It's not the same thing. It's that I want to make a decision that I'm not going to get in trouble for. Okay, so how do I do that? Because I need a post hoc justification. So I buy something from you and it turns out to be terrible, and I get called on the table for it. And what do I say? I say, well, that person was buying from it, and that person was buying from him, and that person was buying from him. Like, all these other people were doing the same thing, so it's not like the error is localized in me, and that's often a very credible story. But if the answer is, well, I evaluated it and decided to take a risk, it's like, well, out the door with you, Sonny, because, that's an indication that you're not capable of doing that sort of thing. So I think part of the reason that people spiral downhill into 0 is because positive feedback, like a positive feedback loop, is a loop that increases the probability that the loop will continue, right? A positive feedback loop is, you've experienced this when you hear microphone feedback in an amplified system. So the microphone sends a message to the speakers, and then the speakers send out the message amplified, and then the microphone picks up the message and it gets amplified again, and you get this howling occur, which can be deafening, but can also destroy the system, because it'll keep amplifying upward until the speakers blow, for example. That's a positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop can spiral you upward, or it can spiral you downward. And so a virtuous circle, a virtuous positive feedback loop, is when, well, I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and now I can say to you, I've traded with these 3 people, and you go talk to them and they say good things, and so then you say, well, I'll trade with you, and then because of that, then you're even more likely to trade with me, and it's like the thing starts to spiral uphill, and it does that, I think, in a nonlinear form. And so, because one of the things you guys are going to be asking yourself as you mature, because what's happening is that income inequality is increasing, right? And you might ask, well, why is that? The first thing you need to know is that that's what income does. So it's not like you need an explanation for it. This is the explanation. It's like a natural rule. If you run a trading game to its logical conclusion, one person ends up with all the money and everyone else ends up with 0. So you don't need an explanation for that. Because it's in the natural order of things that occurs, so to speak. It's a logical consequence of a random trading game with 0 as one of the poles. You still might ask yourself, well, what can you do about income inequality? And that's a perfectly reasonable question. And as I said already, the answer to that is, well, it's an extraordinarily complicated problem to address. We don't really know how to address it. The only time it's really been successfully addressed, as far as I can tell, roughly speaking, is during the Industrial Revolution, especially in the part of the Industrial Revolution that occurred, say, after World War II in the developing world, where for one reason or another, it turned out that there were a tremendous number of high-paying industrial jobs that people who that people could get access to without having had the good fortune of one of these positive feedback loops working for them. But those jobs are disappearing very, very, very rapidly. And one of the problems is, as far as I can tell, is that computational devices are an intelligence and conscientiousness multiplier. And that's a big problem, because the more intelligent people are already, and more conscientious people are already more likely to be tapped up on the winners side of the Pareto distribution. Then you add, if you have an IQ of 150, let's say, you have an IQ of 150, you know how to use a computer, and you live in Silicon Valley. So man, you're a deadly person, right? Because you're super fast. Let's say you're super hardworking. We could also say maybe you're super energetic and healthy, because that also seems to be a criterion that is a real important determinant of that kind of lifetime hyper success. So you're way the hell above average in IQ. You're very, very industrious. You know how to use computers. They're a massive, insanely massive effort multiplier. And then you're surrounded by people who are super smart. It's like there's a lot of things going for you, right? You're going to be moving ahead at an awful, awful rate. That's, again, why places like Silicon Valley are so damn effective, is that they're bringing people from all over the world who are like that into one place. So like Silicon Valley, I don't know if you guys know about the Indian Institute of Technology, but it's India's answer to MIT, and it's one hell of an engineering school. But a huge number of the graduates from India go to Silicon Valley and work there, mostly as entrepreneurs. And they're very good at being entrepreneurs, as it turns out. And they ship money like mad back to India, and that's part of what's driving the Indian economy. But it's just another example, is that because Silicon Valley is already full of brilliant entrepreneurial people, then more brilliant and entrepreneurial people from all over the world flock there like mad. And it's one of these cycles that spirals upward. Very, very difficult to set that up somewhere else. And once it gets going, it's an unbelievably powerful economic engine. Crazily, crazily powerful. So